December 26th, 1983. Madison Square Garden. A sellout crowd. A massive cheer erupts as the current world champion, Bob Backlund, throws his opponent against the ropes and slams him to the mat. They yell with excitement as he begins to execute his finishing move, and then cry out in surprise when his opponent kicks out of the hold. The other man in the ring is the most hated person in professional wrestling. He is a mountain of muscle in blue trunks. Bald, with a waxed handlebar mustache, glistening with sweat, he is known as the Iron Sheik, a champion amateur wrestler from Tehran. The Sheik is the greatest heel in the sport. A bad guy, a mustache-twirling villain. People hate him, and they love to hate him. The crowd is stunned as the Iron Sheik pulls Backlund over onto his stomach, hooks his arms, interlocks his fingers under Backlund's chin, and wrenches. The camel clutch, the Iron Sheik's finishing submission hold. Backlund fights, the crowd screams, and Backlund's manager throws in the towel. It's over. The bell rings 3 times. The crowd is shocked into stunned silence. The Iron Sheik is the World Wrestling Federation champion. The ultimate bad guy has won. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and today I am joined by a special guest. He's an author and a scientist. He's written several books that we are, one of which we're going to talk about today. Dr. Brad Balukjian, thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate having you here.
Hey, happy to be here, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Brad is an LA Times bestseller. He's a freelance writer, and you once did a piece for the Smithsonian on earwig penises that somehow made it into your Wikipedia entry.
Okay, here's the funny thing. Like, I think like the moment you know that you've accomplished something or you've arrived is when you have a Wikipedia page, right? Mm-hmm. As long as you haven't done it yourself.
Right. So, yeah, that's cheating. I still don't have one. I appear on the disambiguation page for many other Ben Thompsons, but if you click it, it takes you to the book and not to me. But I refuse. People are like, just make it yourself. I'm like, no,
I think a lot of people do their own, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think teams of marketing people do these for various people. You can always tell because they list all the accolades with all the like perfect citations. You know, you're like,
right. So having not made my own, I also found it funny that was the one article they chose to highlight.
Yeah, my name is common that I'm on a disambiguation, and it's like me, the famous gunfighter, Count Rumsford, and then like 12 Australian rules football players for some reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, look, I think I made most of my career off of dick jokes, so I can appreciate that's what made it onto yours. Also, my old college roommate is a guy named J. Matt Hoke, and he's a professor, college professor, and I think he is like considered among the world's foremost experts on barnacle penises, which is a thing that we always would give him a hard time about.
Yeah, as you should. Yeah.
Right, yes. Okay, but we're not here to talk about that, at least not entirely. We are here to talk about a book that you've been working on. So I actually read your first book, The Wax Pack, when it was released back in 2020. We have the same literary agent.
Yes.
Well, shout out to Farley Chase right now, I guess. But yeah, he had sent me your book, and I loved the premise of it because you basically opened a pack of baseball cards from 1986 that you had from when you got it in 1986, ate the gum, and then hunted every single player in that pack down to talk to them, including like ambushing Carlton Fisk, who does not like to be ambushed.
Fair statement.
But I read it then, and I thought it was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that book and the kind of the process behind where you got that idea and what made you so inspired to go out and work on that?
Well, it's funny that there's a lot of different ways you could write a book like that, right? Like across the board, whenever I've talked to anyone about the Wax Pack, they love the idea. So I definitely was on to something with the idea of writing an entire book off of the contents, the random contents of one pack of baseball cards. that idea came from having grown up in the 80s collecting cards and spending all of my allowance on packs of cards and chewing the gum and having had thousands of them, and kind of wondering what happened to those players that I grew up with. And when, as a little kid, pre-internet, those players, those cards kind of became your friends in a way, right? You organize them, and we remember the poses. Certain cards stand out in our minds.
Before Baseball Reference, it was the only way to know what that guy's batting average was that year.
That's right. But these are real people behind these cards, and so I was always curious that later on in life as an adult, what happened to them. And so then it was like, okay, well, you could write a lot of different kinds of books with this conceit. And for me, what I wanted to do was not write a book from my couch, right? Mm-hmm. Not just, a lot of baseball books are like, there's no on the road reporting. It's just, I'm going to do a bunch of research about these teams or players, and maybe I'll pick up the phone and do an interview. But I wanted to be like on the road, Hunter S. Thompson style, writing about my first person experiences out there and telling the story of not only the players, but my own story and the road trip itself, and kind of what lessons I learn as I go across the country to meet these guys. And so it has this mix of genres, I would say.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, even among baseball books, it's unique, right? Because like you said, like if you want the crazy stories about partying and stuff, there's the autobiographies of the various players telling their stories about this. And then there's also the super crunchy, like sabermetrics books where they get into all that detail. But that kind of starts to read like a math paper after a while. And, with what you were doing, you kind of were able to combine all of these, but the story for the Wax Pack in a lot of ways ends up being your adventure, like an adventure story from you going out. And, even some of the most interesting parts in that book and in this book are you trying to track these people down, right? It's such an interesting concept and such an interesting way to attack it. And I really thought that was cool. I mean, it helps that I think we are exactly the same age. So I can get in on all the nostalgia trip stuff with you as well, which helps. But, that was such a unique and interesting concept. And now this year you've got a new book out, and you take a similar formula, but you took it in a different direction. So how did you follow up the Wax Pack?
Right. So I pivoted from one childhood obsession to another, this time professional wrestling, which again, I'm 43 years old. So Gen Xers, we can kind of unite around these shared pop culture experiences in the 80s of watching Saturday morning wrestling, collecting baseball cards. And so I had this backstory with the Iron Sheik, who when I was a little kid, he was my favorite wrestler. And that's another sort of common theme for me, is I always liked the underdogs or the unpopular.
I was going to ask, because I think that you're not a real American.
That's right.
He's the bad guy. You can't like
right.
him.
No, I know. I'm turning a lot of heads as a 6-year-old, like cheering for the anti-American, essentially Iranian terrorist. And for me, I mean, at that age, it's like the things that draw you, that attract you are so strange. It was like, I liked the Iron Sheik because he had the mustache and he had the curly toed boots. And, there was something about his look that drew me to him. So years later as an adult, I got to know him personally and actually left my job at a magazine in 2005 to go work on a biography with him. And that's sort of the opening of the Six Pack. This new book is set back in 2005, where I go and I spend a few months outside of Atlanta, Georgia with him. And it just goes completely sideways.
Yeah, it didn't sound like it went well.
Yeah, I mean, literally driving him to buy crack, not exactly the Field of Dreams moment with your childhood hero, right? So yeah, he was in no condition to work on a book back then, and I kind of went on with my life. But with the book, The Six Pack, that just came out, the idea after the Wax Pack was, well, what if I revisit that Iron Sheik story and see if I can find him again, and also tell the story of other wrestlers from that era that were there when he became the champion, and kind of do a similar, crazy gonzo road trip like I did with the Wax Pack, but now for wrestlers.
Yeah. And I think that's a really, talking about why you like the Iron Sheik, like the villains are fun, right? I love villains. I feel like a lot of people, especially nowadays, like the heels in wrestling are some of the most popular characters, right? And so but in the 80s, it was not common to prefer the Iron Sheik to Hulk Hogan.
Right. Yes.
But okay, so I hate to pause, but we need to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about how you picked which wrestlers you chose for your new book. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. We are talking to Dr. Brad Balukjian about his new book, The Six Pack, and in particular about the Iron Sheik, who was probably the most infamous wrestler from the 1980s. Brad, for this book, you can't just open a pack of baseball cards and get randomly assigned a stack of faces and names to hunt down. So I like what you did. So what did you do as your kind of as your recipe for who you were going to go after?
I call it the MacGuffin, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of
that's
like
a great way of putting
Indiana Jones, right? What is the object of your quest?
It was your self-imposed restrictions, yeah.
Right. After the Wax Pack, I knew I would never have a MacGuffin as elegant as the pack of cards.
Yeah.
So then it was like, okay, well, what if I looked at the wrestlers that were on the show in Madison Square Garden when the Iron Sheik became the champion in 1983. So that was what I used to structure the book, was other wrestlers that are still alive, that are spread out around the country, people like Sergeant Slaughter and Tito Santana and Tony Atlas, that I could go find and kind of tell their after wrestling stories, and then also tie it back into the Iron Sheik, who's kind of the star or the real protagonist of this book.
Yeah. And so, well, I think you're probably the protagonist. He might be the antagonist of the story, although
true.
It
Okay, maybe that's
end, right?
Yeah.
So you take the scorecard from December 26, 1983, which is the day the Iron Sheik kind of shocked the world and won the WWF Heavyweight Championship from Bob Backlund, who had been champion for like years at this point, right?
Right.
And he will not hold the title for long, but he's the bad guy. He's from Iran. We're in the middle of the Iranian hostage crisis kind of fallout happening. And so he won, and everybody in Madison Square Garden lost their minds. They were just booing, and they were actually kind of like a little worried for the Sheik's safety. They had to get him out of there. Yeah. And so you take this card and you find all of you list out the living people who were there, wrestlers, and you spend the next 62 days driving 12,500 miles across 33 states, and also flying out to Puerto Rico to find these guys and meet your heroes, even though everyone tells you that that's something you shouldn't do.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so let's start with the Iron Sheik himself, since like you said, he is kind of the main character here. What can you tell me about kind of the early life of the Iron Sheik? I guess I should, as stay on brand here, I should say that we can agree that the Iron Sheik is badass, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I think like
undoubtedly.
Yeah, so he is badass, and like all professional wrestlers seem to kind of list him among when we're talking about like, badasses of early wrestling. He's the real deal. Like he can really do a lot of, he was a real wrestler, right, and like a champion wrestler. Okay, so let's get into his backstory and his early years that growing up in Iran, because he's actually Iranian. Sure. You don't, sometimes with the wrestlers, they claim to be one thing, but they're actually from New York City or whatever.
Right. Or like Boris Zukov was like Jim Nelson from Virginia.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. but the Iron Sheik is actually Iranian.
The Iron Sheik is born Hossein Khosrow Vaziri, went by Khosrow or Khos. And I think part of what made him so successful in his gimmick was that he, as you said, he was the real deal. He was authentic. He was from Iran. The accent was real. When he came to the U.S., he spoke no English, and he was like almost 30 when he came to the U.S. So he was born in a small town called Damgan, east of Tehran, but in his early days moved to Tehran with his family and grew up in Tehran, not wealthy. His parents worked at a family kind of like a bathhouse, and the Iron Sheik. I mean, I even saw his report cards from childhood, and I can tell you he was not a great student. His best grades were in a class called discipline. So who knows what that means?
Very Iranian subject matter here.
and physical education. So not a scholar, but from a young age was just obsessed with wrestling, amateur wrestling, Greco-Roman, freestyle. And in Iran in the 50s, wrestling was pretty much the biggest sport. I mean, maybe soccer was up there, but there was a guy named Gholam Reza Takhti, who was an Olympic gold medalist from Iran, who in wrestling, who became kind of like a folk hero because he was also very politically active and speaking out against the Shah.
Yeah, you kind of talk about him in the book as kind of almost being like a Robin Hood character, like a sports hero that's like coming out and after an earthquake and like helping kids and giving money to the poor. To
this day, apparently in Tehran, if you go to like cafes, his poster is on the wall. Like he's still relevant today.
Wow.
And he was kind of the Iron Sheik's hero growing up, and he kind of even looked like him a little bit, and he modeled his career after him,
and his fighting style and his physique and all of that.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is if you look at old Iron Sheik matches, and he's wearing, or the figure that's on the cover of the book, these sort of like wrestling pants that go down to the knee that say Iran on the side, and they're like very colorful with all these curly cues. And I didn't know until doing research. I saw pictures in Iran. They had these houses of strength called zurkhanes, it's like a gym, but way more than a gym. And it's this sort of ancient arts of grappling and wrestling, but also ritualistic dancing. And for years, men have trained in these zurkhanes. And all of them wear those pants. So those pants are actually like the costume for the gyms there.
I was really curious about that because you mentioned those schools or those dojos. I don't know what you would call them, but you mentioned those in the book, and they sound really. I'd never heard of anything like that before. But they're like gyms that you train in. But like you said, there is kind of the spiritual component. They have basically like an Iranian version of Bushido. That is that Javan Mardi. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but that's associated with these schools. Really, really interesting stuff. And even the Persian clubs that people remember from his pro wrestling days, that seemed like such a unique thing to the Iron Sheik. But in Iran, that's just like an elliptical machine at a gym here, right? Like everyone is swinging those clubs. I didn't know that.
They're called meals, and it's just like MEELS. And that's one of the exercises that they do as part of their routine. So the Iron Sheik spent like his childhood in these places training. It was all about training to be a wrestler.
Yeah, you said he would ride a donkey like 90 minutes a day into a mountain so that he could run at altitude.
Right, because Tehran is, a mountainous area. There's, you can go up in the mountains and there's snow and certain times a year. And he was all about training to be an amateur wrestler, and he became on the national wrestling team. He competed for Iran in his 20s, and that was sort of the path he was on. And then everything changed when the guy I mentioned earlier, his friend Takhti, ended up dead in a hotel room in, I think it was 1968, and it was ruled a suicide, but nobody believed that it was a suicide.
Right. You say in the book that the family hires a private investigator to investigate it, and that guy ends up murdered.
Yeah. So
suspect still at large.
Yes. What happened there is no one still knows, but what we do know is that Takhti was outspoken against the Shah, and he ended up dead. And when that happened, the Iron Sheik was like, okay, well, he was so heartbroken that he basically decided to leave the country and only went back one time after that. So he basically completely turned his back on Iran and embraced America, and came to the U.S. in 1969.
And the story of his arrival is really interesting. I love the story of him arriving. So he's an amateur wrestling, competes for Iran, came in second in the Euro Championships 2 years in a row. He joined the Iranian army at one point and was a bodyguard for the Shah's wife, because he's a big, giant, ripped guy. Let's put him next to the Shah's wife, make sure nobody messes with her. But yeah, when his idol dies, he leaves for the U.S. But I really want you to tell the story about his plan for coming to the United States.
Yeah, well, his plan,
so good.
His entire plan consisted of a name written down in his pocket on a piece of paper that said Alan Rice, which was the name of a wrestling coach in Minnesota who he had met at some international competition, who had probably in a very offhand remark was like, oh yeah, if you ever get to the US, look me up. And the Iron Sheik took that to heart, because bought a one-way ticket to Minneapolis, speaking no English. And his entire plan was to get off the plane and wander around the Minneapolis airport, saying Alan Rice to anyone he could find, until someone find. I mean, this is back, Midwesterners are very, very hospitable people. And yeah. Alan Rice was someone who was well known. So somebody recognized that and called Alan Rice and said, hey, there's this crazy Iranian wandering around saying your name. Like, you might want to come down here.
Yeah, he gets off the plane. He just goes around asking, and they're like, well, you're a giant dude. You're probably here for the wrestling version of Alan Rice. We'll look him up in the yellow pages, give him a call. Yeah. And then Rice is just like, put him in a taxi and send him over here.
Pretty much.
I'll get the basement ready for him.
Stays at his house and then puts him up in his fraternity house from college, and sets him up with a job helping him coach the Minnesota Wrestling Club. And then, the Iron Sheik now is training Olympic athletes, because in 1972, here we are, the Olympics starts tonight in Paris in 2024. In 1972, the Iron Sheik was helping Alan Rice coach the Greco-Roman wrestling team for the Munich Olympics. And so, the ultimate irony is that the Iron Sheik, who's this evil anti-American, heel, was actually a coach, an Olympic U.S. wrestling coach.
Yeah. And he won a couple years, like that same year, 1972, he wins gold for the U.S.
At the AAU.
At the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union. He had gotten silver a year before, and then he gets gold in 1972, but for the U.S., right? And now he's traveling to the Olympics to coach Greco-Roman wrestling for Team USA, which, you wouldn't expect when you watch some of the footage of the Iron Sheik talking to Hulk Hogan.
Yes.
But coaching the Olympics Greco-Roman wrestling team in 1972 didn't pay the bills.
Right.
So he had to kind of find some backup work.
Yeah. Well, as he said, he would say, you can't eat your gold medal. And what's so interesting about this whole story would have this could never happen now, because when if we just skip ahead for a second to when he's wrestling Hulk Hogan, nowadays everyone would know with the internet and with everything that who he really was in real life. But it's kind of crazy, right, to think that those 20-some thousand people watching that match that night. I mean, again, most of them, I'm sure, knew that wrestling was staged. But they had no idea that this guy, they had no way of knowing that he had actually been an Olympic wrestling coach. Again, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this, but imagine watching someone perform in, whether it's sports or entertainment, whatever now, and literally having no idea or no ability to know who they actually are.
Yeah, right. I mean, and wrestling fans are generally pretty informed today, and they'll know, and it's fun to go out and boo the villain, and then, but they talk about it. You talk a lot about kayfabe, which is the kind of wrestling slang. That's kind of commonplace now. We're like, oh, he's going to turn heel. I can feel it, blah, 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 and, but in those days, not only was that not, people suspected it, people probably thought it, but it wasn't those terms weren't common knowledge, and wrestlers and wrestling were not interested, like professional wrestling was not interested in talking about it as though this isn't 100% everything that the entire product we're putting out is true, right?
And if you were to run into the Iron Sheik at the gas station, he would not tell you anything about his real identity.
He'd be the Iron Sheik, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like I heard a story from somebody who met Rob Zombie once, because like I was talking to somebody who worked on one of his movies, and I was like, I was in some screenwriting class, and there were a bunch of people asking all of these very informed and important questions about being an assistant producer on a big time movie, and I was like, what's Rob Zombie like? I gotta know.
Yeah.
And she was like, he's awesome. Like, he's super cool, super chill. He'll be wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and he'll just be kind of hanging out like, I think I want to do this. And then somebody will come up and be like, can I have your autograph? And she'll like, you can watch him transform into Rob Zombie. And he'll be like, yeah, of course. And it's like, but a lot of these guys in the 80s, and you touch this a lot in the book, that like, they kind of had to live that, because they're doing this every single day. And sometimes it starts to,
and along those lines, like, imagine me asking for your autograph and you not writing Ben Thompson, right? Like, it's kind of trippy that they write their autograph Iron Sheik, not Khosrow Vaziri. I mean, that's not his name, but he's writing this fictional name for his autograph.
Yeah, wow, I didn't even think about that. But yeah, I mean, this is a theme that comes up throughout the book of, people trying to kind of, after their career is over, trying to figure out who they actually are, trying to separate their actual person from their wrestling persona.
To answer your question about what's next, so yes, Iron Sheik in the early 70s. And again, at this point, there is no Iron Sheik. He's Khosrow Vaziri. He's a 190-pound...
Coach Kaz, right?
Yeah, ripped, full head of hair, really good-looking young guy. And he sees that, okay, like, and it also, what's interesting is like, there is no such thing as pro wrestling in Iran. Like, it just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So when he sees his first wrestling matches, which would have been the AWA up in Minnesota, he was like, what the hell is this? Like, this is not wrestling. This is like these guys like bouncing off the ropes and getting hit with a chair. Like, it's like a disgrace, right?
Yeah, especially because, like you said, Greco-Roman wrestling is like such a huge deal in Iran, and everybody watched it then. Yeah, to come there and watch somebody climbing the turnbuckle and vamping to the crowd and getting ready to do like a jump off the top, the Macho Man's big elbow, right? Like, that's not standard. That's not commonplace. You don't see that at the Olympics. Well, maybe you should.
So I think he was unimpressed, but also he was unimpressed by the whole spectacle, but probably very impressed by the fact that these guys were making good money.
Right.
And so he basically begged Alan Rice to hook him up with Vern Gagne, who was the promoter in the AWA. And he trained in late 1972 with Ric Flair and Ken Patera and Jim Brunzell and Greg Gagne, these other guys that went on to become big names, to train to be a pro wrestler. But even then, his first few years, he really just kind of kicked around, and he was wrestling under his real name as a sort of bland good guy, getting no traction. And, at that point, one of the guys I interviewed who he had coached, Dan Chandler, told me that at one point, the Iron Sheik came to him and like asked if he could introduce him to his tree trimming boss. So, in an alternate universe, the Iron Sheik was just a tree trimmer in Minneapolis.
Right. The most ripped tree trimmer in the tri-state area or whatever, the Tri-Cities. So, and he's working. You mentioned he's working as a welder for some part to try to make some extra money. And again, he goes back to the Olympics again in '76 to coach the U.S. team, like be an assistant coach on the U.S. Greco-Roman wrestling team. But yeah, he's welding to make ends meet. He's watching Sesame Street to learn English. He's trying to like teach himself. He goes and gets his GED, right, to study English. And and so 76, 77. I think you mentioned that it was during those Olympics that he makes the decision to take on a real, like really embrace the like professional wrestling life and kind of take on a different persona. Yeah.
And it was actually his promoter's wife, Mary Gagne, that had the idea of the Iron Sheik name. He had said, Iron Sheik, he said, I want to be a bad guy. I want to turn heel. And Mary Gagne said, well, what if you were the Iron Sheik? And there's already a very well-established guy named The Sheik, a guy named Eddie Farhat. So you couldn't just be the Sheik. But Iron Sheik because she said, your body is made of iron, could be your character. And so I really feel bad for his wife, Carol, who was very helpful to me with my whole book, because she met him and married him in 1975 and married this, again, very handsome, full head of hair Iranian guy. And now a year later, he's shaving the head, growing this crazy mustache.
Yeah, he's got this big handlebar mustache with like the ends like waxed, right?
Right, the very cartoonish kind of mustache, and now he's a bad guy, right? And now their family's life is in danger because people are calling in death threats and slashing his tires. And
yeah, because what you said before, in 76, 77, Iran is not really on the forefront of the news, and it's only in his timing to turn heel is perfect because in 1979 is when the Iranian coup happens.
Well, and even in those early years, he even toyed with he changed his name a little bit. At one point he was from Saudi Arabia, and then he's from Lebanon, and so he was this sort of generic, Arab or Middle Eastern heel. And at that point, Iran was still a pretty close ally to the United States. And then everything changed with the hostage crisis.
Yeah. And then he's the right person in the right place, in the right industry at the exact right time to become, the most hated man in professional sports, maybe just the biggest heel, the best time. Right. And it all kind of catapults him up into being a household name, culminating with 1983, where he becomes the WWF champion. And it's like, what is happening with this? And that's kind of where we pick up
your story. This is the event where you're going to track down everybody that is on this card for this night. So let's take a really quick break. And then when we get back, we're going to get into that. So stay with us. Okay, so Brad, you are on the road and you're searching for people who are on the lineup card that night at Madison Square Garden.
Tony Atlas, Tito Santana, Sergeant Slaughter, the Masked Superstar. You go to Puerto Rico to meet Jose Luis Rivera. Talk to me a little bit about that adventure and your wild Hunter S. Thompson road trip.
Right. I was interested in writing a book that was now more than just the Iron Sheik story. I was really interested in any patterns I could find among these guys from this era who had wrestled at a time like we're talking about when the promoters said that it was a real sport, and that and the schedule, the road schedule for these guys back then was just insane. I mean, 330 days a year, no off season.
Yeah, driving 12 hours a day to go to the next thing, to do the super physically intensive activity for very little money, right? You talked about the training, even when Iron Sheik and Ric Flair are training for the for professional wrestling, it's in a cold barn outside in Minnesota. You're wrestling on basically the floor, right? It doesn't pay much. It's hard work. It's extremely damaging to your body, and you never have a day off. You're always going. It's this kind of brutal schedule for these guys.
And just so I could know what it's like, in one of the chapters in the book, I went myself to a day of training at a wrestling school in New Jersey, just to know, okay, what is it like to hit the ropes and take a bump? And I was like, oh man, this sucks. I mean,
I was going to ask you about that, because it was you really committed. You did take a wrestling class.
Yeah, and I wanted to put that in there just to show my appreciation for what they do. And also have a chance to kind of talk about the history of pro wrestling, where it came from. How did this uniquely American attraction come to be? And so, yeah, the book is my journey all over the country, and not just to talk to the wrestlers, but I go to wherever possible, their hometowns, right, where they grew up, and talk to their family, their coaches. I mean, I talked to Sergeant Slaughter's 90-year-old high school football coach. And and in a way, what was fun about that was, in a way, this is also a travel book, because you can learn a lot about somebody from the environment that they grew up in. So the Masked Superstar growing up in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, this little coal town, talking about what that was like versus Mission, Texas, near the border where Tito Santana grew up. And his real name is Merced Solis, and telling his backstory. So, it really is an investigation of like the line between these two personas, the real person and the character, which is why the title of every chapter is the character versus the real person.
Yeah. I mean, I'm super impressed. Like, so I've been doing Badass for like 20 years now. But I'm always so impressed by like real journalism, like where you go there and you were very thorough, right? You're driving to all of these different places in the car. And you're talking to these people, you're talking to their friends, their families, like you said, their old football coaches, guys who used to be in a band with them. You're taking a wrestling class for this. Like, you've really committed to doing all of the research, and it really comes through in the book, like how well researched it is and all of the interesting stories that all of their friends and family tell.
I got my start in journalism as a fact checker, so that's always like on my mind, is like having to make sure that I'm being accurate as best I can.
So how did researching this differ from the Wax Pack? Because it's a different type of person.
Yeah. The process was similar in that I just did a lot of upfront reading, but one main difference, and what made this harder, is that there is really no written record of wrestling, right? I mean, sports is great because you have beat writers that cover every team every season. So every newspaper, you've got tons of information. Wrestling it was not covered by the media.
And for the purposes that we've been talking about, where like they don't want you to know that the Iron Sheik is actually Team USA assistant coach, right? They wanted you to think that he is an Iranian guy who hates America and wants to beat up Hulk Hogan, right? And so a lot of that stuff was purposely just not disclosed. And like you said, it's to the point where sometimes some of these guys even get, having a little bit of issues kind of remembering where the line is.
Well, it's also it's hard to find the truth in wrestling because the whole industry is about not telling the truth.
Yeah, that's fair.
So trying to nail down what happened or when, and to make it accurate. And wrestlers love to tell stories and repeat stories. I took that on like with the Hulk Hogan chapter. There's been a lot of mythology around Hulk Hogan's backstory, so I really wanted to try to fact check some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what did you learn talking to these guys? What was kind of the takeaway from meeting all of these different wrestlers? Because, you're not sure what you're going to get. You don't know any of these guys personally. You haven't really been following their story that much since nobody really has. They kind of finish their career and they move on. And, what did you learn from talking to all these guys?
Yeah, I learned that like the baseball players, one of the things that comes out of these books is just realizing that the shared experience, the commonalities that we have with these people, right? That we're all people, that the things that they're struggling with are the same things that we struggle with. And so by sort of humanizing them and telling the stories of who they really are, I think readers will hopefully identify more with them as peers rather than idols or distant superheroes. At the same time, uncovering their humanity, there's a very sort of dark or sad side of the story, which is how broken down most of them are, because they did live their character, become their characters, but the physicality, the drug abuse, and the fact that they're independent contractors with no retirement, no health insurance, no benefits.
That's why there's no health insurance.
There's no union. Tony Atlas was still wrestling at this stage, which is insane. There's no way he should still be wrestling.
Yeah. And this is a thing that I I think about a lot with Badass because, I will tell these stories of these people who did these amazing badass things, right? This guy was in World War II and he went and he was shot 5 times and then he blew up these 3 bunkers and then he stabbed like 4 guys with his bare hands. That's badass, right? And, that's the story. The story is this guy's from a small town. He gets drafted into World War II. He goes over to the European front. He gets in this big battle. He wins the Medal of Honor. He's this great hero. He comes home. They throw him a parade. Story over. But that guy's life continues. And for a lot of these guys, like, you ask them about that and they're like, yeah, my leg hurts because I got shrapnel still in it. They can't get it out without piercing my femoral artery. And also, yeah, I killed like 12 guys, but like, I don't feel great about that, right? You know?
That's a great point that I don't think that I haven't even thought about enough, which is for whether it's, again, baseball players or wrestlers or other badasses, like they exist for us in this snapshot in time, and then they don't exist at all anymore. Right. It's like for us, it's not parasitic, but we are benefiting from this little bit of shared memory that like we have that makes us feel good, because usually it's some kind of escapism for us.
Right. And there's inspiration to this, right? This guy, look at the Iron Sheik, right? He came from a very rural part of Iran, under some oppression from the Shah. He got out, he came here, he became a superstar. He beat up Hulk Hogan on TV, right? Like, that's an inspirational story for some people. And, we don't want to think that maybe that he was sad after that,
right. And so to your point, it's for these people that are our heroes, like their lives go on, their scars go on. We have the luxury of not really having to think about it, but that's kind of what my books force you to do, right? Is to reckon with the fallout of that heroism. And it doesn't mean that you have to feel bad about, worshiping these guys, but it means that I think it presents them in a more well-rounded, sympathetic light to see the cost of all that.
Yeah, they're just guys, right? They're just people.
Yeah.
Which is, in some ways, makes them more inspirational in that, like, they aren't these superheroes, right? They weren't born with magical abilities. They were just some guy, and they were able to become like an international celebrity. But also, on the other hand, like, maybe we should just treat these guys like real guys instead of heroizing them, right? Or so I think it can be inspirational, but also, like you said, really try to reframe the way that you think about these as human beings rather than as the Iron Sheik, right?
And I don't know if doing the podcast has affected you, but writing these books has affected how I watch baseball or sports or wrestling in a way that I think is healthy. Like, I may not get as into it, but it's because I know that what I'm watching on TV is going to play out in many different ways, way beyond what I'm watching on TV. And so it's just kind of a recognition again of that, like, these are people with, complicated lives.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get back to the Sheik, but before that, you have traveled around, you've talked to all of these people. You came across some really wild stories, and a lot of them are in the book. And if you're listening to this, you should check it out because it's really worth it. But for time purposes, we kind of want to focus on the Sheik here. But I would love for you to tell me one or two of your favorite stories from meeting these people and hearing about, like, because professional wrestling in the 80s was kind of a wild time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess one that jumps to mind is Jose Luis Rivera, who was what they call a jobber, the guy that always lost on Saturday morning. I personally liked Juventud Guerrera and Dean Malenko for jobber dudes. Well, so Jose Luis, he was a reliable guy that, he was never a star, but he wrestled for many years and was well liked by everybody. And I asked him at one point, because I'd say, like, even though he was the least famous of the people I wrote about, he was arguably like the happiest and the most well-adjusted now in his life.
Because he didn't have to deal with all the fame.
Yeah, and he keeps a more level head, and but also, I asked him, like, how did you not fall into the trap of, like, all the drugs and the on the road and that whole life? And he was like, well, I didn't make enough money but I mean, that didn't stop some people still. But he had a funny story about how like he was at a show, before a show one day or after a show, and the Junkyard Dog, who was a well-known star, called him into a limo, and the Junkyard Dog had like, the guy had a bunch of, whoever they were with had a bunch of cocaine, and Junkyard Dog forked over like $200 or $300, for the coke, and went to Jose Luis and like, oh, you want to buy some too? And he's like, no, that's like a week's pay, like I'm not gonna. But in a way, like that, he had the sense to be very careful with whatever money he did have, and as a result, he's probably in better shape now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's get back to the Sheik. So in 1983, he becomes December 26th, the day after Christmas, 1983, he becomes the WWF champion. And he is knocked off relatively quickly because a new person is emerging on the scene in WWF, and he's going to kind of change things for good. And that is Hulk Hogan.
Right.
So there is a wild story that you talk about in your book about, Vince McMahon kind of goes to the Sheik, and he's like, all right, you're going to lose to this new guy, Hulk Hogan. We're bringing him over from the American Wrestling Association. I'd love for you to tell the story about the decision the Sheik is faced with this.
Yeah. So the Iron Sheik wins the belt in December of 83. And then a month later, he's going to wrestle Hulk Hogan. And it's pretty clear that he's going to have to lose the belt. And so his old boss, Vern Gagne, who I mentioned earlier from the AWA, calls him up and says, I'll give you $100,000 if you break Hulk Hogan's leg for real and take the championship to Minnesota and defect. And the Iron Sheik, gives it some serious thought, because that's a lot of money. And that was, Vern Gagne was the guy that broke him into wrestling and gave him his big break. He certainly could break Hulk Hogan's leg at will, because, Hulk, although physically impressive, was not an amateur wrestler. And so he kind of wrestled with this and actually went to Sergeant Slaughter, who was in storyline what became one of his biggest rivals, but in real life was a good friend of his, and said, what do you think I should do? And Slaughter, real name is Bob Remus, said, absolutely do not break Hulk Hogan's leg.
You had a funny line in there where you're like, at no point did like the ethics of this enter his mind, right? He thought like, oh, the $100,000 to torpedo my career, maybe,
or the legal consequences, or any of that. Yeah. Let me commit first degree assault in front of 20,000 people in a ring.
I'll say it was an accident.
Yeah.
See, professional wrestling is real.
Yeah. So he did not do it, and so the plan goes off as anticipated, with Hulk Hogan vanquishing the Iron Sheik, and that really is the moment that kind of changes wrestling history forever, right? Where it really puts the WWF on this path of just domination and going national, and becoming this multi-billion-dollar company that it is now.
Yeah, like the Hulkamania runs wild after that, right?
Yeah,
and but the Sheik, like, so I mean, the Hulk Hogan kind of just takes over everything. He becomes just internationally recognized name. I think you mentioned that there was a study like last year that they asked 500 people to name one professional wrestler, and everybody said, like, the vast majority of people said Hulk Hogan. I mean, and Hulk Hogan was the perfect guy for the job, right? He looked the part. He had that crazy, like, over the top personality. He had a good gimmick. He had been like a rock star and a bodybuilder. He had the charisma. He had the look. He body slammed Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 1, which was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen in pro wrestling. I think maybe like Mankind getting chokeslammed through the cage, and I think Goldberg jackhammered the Giant in 1998. I watched that live, and I remember thinking that it was like the craziest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. But the Sheik, he loses the championship, but he's not done. He becomes, like, as wrestling grows, his like fame grows as well, right? He starts this feud with Sergeant Slaughter. He wins the tag championship at WrestleMania 1, and he becomes kind of, their action figures. He's doing appearances. He's becomes famous in the U.S.
Yeah, his star just takes off, right? So that was Sergeant Slaughter's point when he's like, "Don't break his leg." It's like, you're going to be on this gravy train, and you're going to make a lot more money with us than you will breaking his leg. Yeah. And sure enough, yeah, he goes on to several years of really making a lot of money and becoming a household name and a major star. Wasn't until he got arrested in 1987 for drugs that kind of torpedoed everything.
Yeah, he's arrested in 87, and like there's always this question of like, was it more damaging that he was carrying he had open containers and cocaine in the car with him? Because we kind of expect that for wrestlers. But the real thing that scandalized everybody was that he was in the car with Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who he was rivals with on the mat.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, so that kind of gets him expelled from WWF. He comes back a couple times after that, but I mean, he's banned for life, which in the wrestling world means like 6 months. He comes back, he bounces in and out again. He's still wrestling. Can we talk a second about his reputation in Iran? Because he is this Iranian hero, and he comes out there, and he's kind of famous. His ring personality, for people who are not super familiar with the Iron Sheik, he was this big, ripped guy, and he would come out there and he would wear these pants that say Iran, and he would talk about like Iran #1, right? And he would just kind of play against whoever was it's cheap heat, right? It's you get one guy out there waving an American flag, you get another guy coming out there waving an Iranian flag, and you see who like the audience at some arena in Nebraska roots for, right? It's easy, but he is kind of this pro-Iranian guy. He's kind of a caricature of it. He's extremely a caricature of it. But what is the perception of him in Iran while all this is going on?
Yeah, and that's something that it's never talked about, but I wanted to look into that for the book. So I spoke to a journalist in Iran who wouldn't even give me. I was not allowed to put his name in the book because to this day they're not really free there.
Right.
But he basically said that no one knew the Iron Sheik in Iran. It was just complete.
Just blackout.
No idea, because they had no access to Western media, state-controlled media. And for those people that may know, maybe people in the government, they thought it was a disgrace that he was this, he was Iranian, but now he's basically playing this cartoon character to vilify Iran and just feed this anti-Iranian, pro-American patriotism or hatred of Iran. Yeah. And sort of playing off the stereotype. And so, yeah, he was not known or popular at all in Iran while he was at his peak in the U.S.
I could see that, of being like, what are you doing to us here, right? You're just kind of like stoking anti-Iranian, media. And I could understand that being a little bit.
But what's interesting is that there were people at his funeral, in the epilogue of the book, I met someone who grew up in, I think it was the United Arab Emirates. So the more free Arab countries in the Middle East that did have some access to Western media and did see wrestling. And people who grew up in those countries liked the Iron Sheik, even though Iranians are not Arabs and they speak Farsi and they don't speak Arabic. Like it was similar enough being from that region.
Right. That, you don't have a lot of there wasn't a lot of representation in professional wrestling. If you like wrestling and you like professional wrestling, that is your representation. Right. And so,
so it's interesting that some kids in other countries, Arab countries, did like the Iron Sheik at that time.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So he has this kind of meteoric rise. He becomes the Iron Sheik. Everybody loves to hate him, or in your case, you just love him. And he goes through his career. He has this arrest in '87, and from that point on, he's kind of bouncing back and forth. Like the WrestleMania 1, like the highlight of this would be, we kind of end the story there. But as you have continued to do with your career, you want to see what happens after most people would have ended the book. And so you show up at his house in 2005 because you want to write a biography on him. And as we said in the beginning, that doesn't go well.
No, he threatens to kill me. The first line of the book is the Iron Sheik just threatened to kill me.
Right.
He was volatile and, just a prisoner of his own addiction at that point.
Yeah, he was dealing with addiction, and he was dealing with some other stuff as well.
Yeah, his eldest daughter got murdered in 2003. I mean, some really awful things happened to him. So that he was not in a state to work on that.
Yeah, and so you were trying to come down there and interview with him, and like you said, his wife sounds amazing, and she was trying to help facilitate, but he was kind of depressed and addicted, and things were not looking good. And so you ended up scrapping that project after he threatened to kill you. So now, it's 15 years later, 20 years later, you are going to go back and meet him again. So how are you feeling as you're about to go see the Iron Sheik again for the first time in, was it 15 years?
Yeah, I was nervous. I was hopeful because his daughter, Nikki, who I'm friends with, had told me that he had totally cleaned up. Mm-hmm. And she's like, you're not going to believe him when you see him, like how different he is. And I was okay, but I was still like, I don't know.
Does he still have that Bowie knife?
Yeah, right. So I was cautiously optimistic, as the cliche goes. And that really, I won't spoil the whole ending, but I will say that it was a very nice full circle moment to see him back to being Khosrow Vaziri. Kind of where he started, right, as this very humble, very chivalrous guy, who I think always was under there, but had been lost for a long time.
Yeah. I think it's really powerful, and people should definitely read it.
And what was unexpected was that meeting was like July of 2022, and then less than a year later he died, and so. Unexpected. I mean, I remember I turned the book in to my editor, and like 4 days later or something, I get a text from his daughter saying he just passed away in his sleep. And so now I'm on a plane back to Atlanta and now writing an epilogue about the funeral. And so added a whole nother layer to the project.
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you this. So what is your takeaway from this book? What's the message that you learned from the life of the Iron Sheik and from doing this adventure and from traveling around and kind of seeing all of these people? What kind of lesson did you learn?
Mm-hmm. Well, wrestling is a simplistic dichotomy of baby faces and heels, right? And the real people are neither or both, right?
Yeah.
We're all somewhere between babies. There are days when we're heels and there's days when we're baby faces. And I think what I wanted to do ultimately was just to get at a sense of truth in wrestling. I wanted to know what's true. What is the real story? Who are these people actually really? What are they about? So it's sort of antithetical to the construct of wrestling, but it's rewarding when you do this kind of adventure to find out what actually is underneath and what is true. And I think I did the best I could to find that truth in this world.
Well, Brad, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think that I think the book's great, and I think people should definitely check it out. And we learned that the Iron Sheik is badass, and we learned that badasses are complicated.
Yes.
So Brad Balukjian, the book is called The Six Pack. It came out in April of this year, 2024. Brad, where can people find more of your stuff?
Sure. And thanks again for having me. So I'm on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, at Brad Pack Books. And lately, since the book came out, I've been doing some new stuff I have a Patreon site. So if you go to thebradpack.com, my site, you'll see I've started to put up some new interviews with former athletes and wrestlers, but also a lot of the bonus content from the book. So, I only got to use a very small fraction of the material that I collected. So I have photos and audio from my interviews and documents that I found that I'm putting on the site for people to check out. So hopefully people will give that a look.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So, Brad, thank you so much for being on the show. People should definitely check out your book and check out your website. Thank you so much for being here. It was really great getting to talk to you.
Cool. Thank you.
Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.